Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I'm continuing on with my Shroud solo series. But before I get into that, just a couple of RSM announcements. So, hopefully, the show should have come out with Dr. Tony Costa on Jesus' miracles and the historicity of his miracles outside of his resurrection. If not, then I'll be posting up this Shroud solo show for you guys to fill that. But, again, Tony Costa has agreed to come on. I'm sure he's on, and that show went great. So let's assume that's the case. But specifically in terms of Shroud announcements. So obviously I've got various shows in the works and that sort of thing. In terms of the Shroud of Turin, I've got great news. So in addition to doing my Shroud solo shows, and I was hoping to bring on Barry Schwartz and Hugh Ferry to have a discussion sometime after this semester. Also in the works, sometime after Easter, I've got great news. Giulio Fonte and Bob Seifgart and Bob Rucker have all agreed to come on and do a show together discussing their respective image-forming mechanisms, some of the pros and cons, as well as giving some of the most recent scientific evidences proving that the Shroud dates to the 1st century, that it is currently being published in new peer-reviewed science journals and that sort of thing. So I'll give more details going forward, but yeah, they're going to be discussing their various image-forming mechanisms, how those relate to minimal relevant features, and we're bringing on the experts themselves. Giulio Fonte, who's never been on the show before, and Bob Seifgart, who I've linked to. He's the one responsible for that great PowerPoint, the summarizing all of the evidence for the Shroud of Turin and that sort of thing. So I'm really looking forward to having them on. And this discussion that we're doing might come in a part 2. I'm going to have to organize that after I get this show locked and loaded, because Bob Rucker has also agreed if I can bring on John Jackson and Mark Antonacci to, once again, yes, a 3-way discussion discussing the pros and cons of each of their respective theories about how the Shroud of Turin's images were formed supernaturally or extraordinarily by God. So this is kind of a battle of all the pro-Shroud experts, the theories of the supernatural theories or the extraordinary type theories that purport to explain the Shroud of Turin, and we're going to be able to hear from the experts. How do they relate to each other? How do they perform in terms of my minimal relevant features and all that good stuff? So you're going to be getting the very latest information on that front. So yeah, look forward to that. Sometime after Easter, we'll hopefully have the first show of that. But other than that, yeah, let's get straight into my Shroud solo show here. Okay, so we're moving on to the next ordinary naturalistic hypothesis. And on this front, I mentioned last time that we're going to be looking at what's called the Volckringer Patterns mechanism or hypothesis. So this is an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, just requires a body, no artist or intelligent artistic intent, to create the images, just the laws of nature and a dead body wrapped in the shroud would produce the images, and it's postulated here that they are Volckringer patterns. So what is this about? So essentially, this image-forming mechanism was first proposed by Dr. Jean Volckringer. So Volckringer patterns are named after him. He's the scientist who discovered them back in 1942. So obviously 1942, this is prior to the 1978 Stirp investigation. So this guy's totally ignorant about all of the minimal relevant features and that sort of thing. But still, even after, in 1991, he still proposed this mechanism for explaining the Shroud's images. And he's not alone. Another Shroud skeptic, John DeSalvo, back in 1982, he also published a paper suggesting Volckringer patterns as perhaps the mechanism forming the Shroud of Turin's images. And I'll be linking to his paper on this on my blog, so take a look at that and read it for yourself. Okay, so let's find out a little bit about this theory and a little bit about the people behind it. So who's Dr. John Volckringer? Obviously, he's the one that Volckringer patterns are named after. So essentially, he was a pharmacist living in Paris during the time of World War II in about 1942. And it was at this time that he discovered that with certain plants, when they're pressed between the pages of a book over a long period of time, decades or centuries, then they'll actually leave high-resolution, detailed photographic negative images of the plant or the leaf that was pressed between the pages on the adjacent pages of the book. So he subsequently proposed, well, look, these Volckringer patterns, maybe this is an image-forming mechanism for the Shroud of Turin. And as I said later on in 1982, John DeSalvo also made a subsequent theory, a revised theory using Volckringer patterns, but he combined Volckringer patterns with various elements of the direct contact hypothesis, as well as gas diffusion and the Volckringer method. And he claimed that this revised Volckringer patterns hypothesis, or what he called the quote-unquote revised vapographic direct contact hypothesis, that's what he called it in his paper, these in turn produce the shroud images. Okay, so what is this Volckringer patterns all about? How does it work? Well, essentially it entails that Volckringer patterns in the form of the Shroud Man were formed as a result of certain acids being formed, being on the body and then being transferred through direct contact and in gas evaporation format to the cloth. So it's kind of like gas evaporation again, but it's specific acids, right? So in this case, we're looking specifically at lactic acid, and that's something that human sweat or perspiration contains a certain amount of this lactic acid in addition to water. Yeah, the words of John DeSalvo here, they'll say, quote unquote, it is likely that a person who had been tortured and crucified, like Jesus, would have sweated profusely, thereby producing significant large amounts of lactic acid. So it's the lactic acid that's the key ingredient with these Volckringer patterns here. Then these acids basically in turn resulted in cellulose degradation or modifications to the cellulose's molecules, thereby creating an image over time, taking time and yellowing the image, creating the color that we see on the Shroud of Turin in terms of its body images. So it's much closer here with the Volckringer patterns. Well, it's not so much a stain, it's degrading this acid is degrading the cellulose itself, just like what pro-shroud experts who argue for radiation say. You know, it's degraded cellulose. It turns yellowish with radiation or, ultraviolet light or whatever you want to say. Or, in this case, the shroud skeptic is saying, or with lactic acid being vaporized or transferred to the cloth in the form of the body images. Interesting. So yeah, that's how the method essentially works. Obviously, in terms of the bloodstains, once again, that's impossible to take place through Volckringer patterns. That only can take place through direct contact, painting, or a hybrid of both in terms of an ordinary naturalistic or an ordinary artistic mechanisms. We saw in previous shows, all those mechanisms fail. You have to rely on some kind of extraordinary mechanism to explain the bloodstains. So this theory automatically fails, and it doesn't even attempt to try to explain how the bloodstains got there. They just assume direct contact can do it, which we've already proven is false. But putting aside the bloodstains, basically the Volckringer patterns, again, they're focusing specifically on the body images. How do we get those body images? Now, just before we get into our assessment of the minimal relevant features, there are a couple of important general notes to say here. Obviously, in terms of the Volckringer pattern method, where we put a leaf or a plant inside of a book and press the pages down for decades or centuries, and then voila, an image, photographic negative, high-resolution image will appear on some of the adjacent pages far from the plant through this lactic acid transferring and degrading the cellulose of the paper or the pages in a book. Well, obviously that doesn't directly translate to, well, the body. I mean, let's pretend we crush a body with 2 stone slabs of the equivalent of weight of a plant being squished, and that lactic acid oozes out and stains the pages. Obviously that doesn't work, right? The body would be crushed, the bones would be smashed to smithereens. Jesus would be, or the Shroud Man would be as flat as a pancake, and we wouldn't get 3-dimensional information. So obviously it's not a direct analogy, right? The point here is about the lactic acid producing these degraded cellulose images when they make contact with the linen cloth. in one form or another. So that's the main point if you're going to go with this. So let's not attack a straw man where, the Volckringer Patterns, it's a leaf being pressed hardcore in a book over decades or centuries. Yeah, well, I mean, Jesus' body we know that the Shroud Man was in there for less than 3 days before rigor mortis stopped and before decomposition liquids were there. And are you saying he was crushed in like something putting an equivalent amount of pressure on him? No, we would get like a flattened pancake. We would get that Agamemnon effect throughout his whole body. So obviously that's not what the method's calling for. So just let's be charitable on that front. As obviously in terms of the leaf or the plants being pressed in the book for decades and centuries, that's required to get that lactic acid pressed out of the plant and therefore degrade the cellulose, where that's not the case with a body and or a statue. Maybe there's a 3D statue that's coated with sweat or something, and lactic acid transfers to the cloth that way or something. Obviously, if you posit a statue instead of a body, well, then you go into the problems. Well, how do you get those anatomical accuracies from a medieval statue? That's historically impossible or very implausible to be the case, and those sorts of issues. But the point here is I'm just saying, yeah, obviously, in order to squeeze out the lactic acid from a plant or leaf, you need that high pressure from the book. That's not necessarily applicable to the lactic acid in sweat on a human body, or for whatever reason somebody covers a statue in the medieval ages full of sweat or something like that. So just be aware of that. Now, in terms of Dr. Volckringer, there's a lot of controversy here in terms of, so we'll get to this when we get to the color and the additional features, but does it produce, Dr. Volckringer says it produces the same color, identical color as the Shroud of Turin, whereas pro-Shroud experts say, nope, it's brown, it's not the same color. There's controversy here in terms of some of the results, and there is an issue. Even Shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry have said, look, we want the primary literature. Where's the peer-reviewed literature? There's none. Where's the proof of this and the primary literature, so we can see what the actual experimental results are in terms of the Shroud skeptic side here. And unfortunately, it seems to me that even Hugh Ferry is saying, look, we just don't have it. We just have competing claims on some of these issues. So that will be a bit of an issue in terms of evaluating this method and that sort of thing. But it's important to note, look, John DeSalvo is more recent. He's a more recent update, and he's got important modifications. So, for example, he uses gas evaporation, so lactic acid evaporates through a vertical gas diffusion theory. Some kind of, along with this Volckringer patterns being produced by lactic acids. And he also incorporates Dr. John German's sagging cloth. Remember the wet sagging cloth version of the direct contact mechanisms that we evaluated in part 13. So he's kind of using various combination of theories because he's after Stirp. He knows what some of the minimal relevant features are that he has to incorporate into his method. So he's got some nuance as to his version of the revised version of this Volckringer pattern method. So just bear that in mind. Again, we'll get to the controversies when we get to it, and I'll give the appropriate quotes there. But let's get into assessment. So let's start with the first minimal relevant feature, the fact that the Shroud has photographic negative images and or quasi-negative images, image diffuseness, and the high-resolution nature of the images. Well, in the first place, as Dr. Volckringer himself discovered scientifically back in 1942, this mechanism is definitely capable of producing both high-resolution and photographic negative images of at least plants and leaves when they're pressed in those books. That much is totally uncontroversial, scientifically proven fact. And remember, well, what about that counter feature? What if it's only a quasi-negative image? Well, remember, whenever it comes to counter features, they will only be used to help Shroud skeptic theories, never to hurt Shroud skeptic theories. So there may be an issue in terms of the quasi-negative ability because this produces full-on photographic negative images. If the shroud images are only quasi-negative images, this method fails. But we never would hold that against the theory. We can't prove that they are just quasi-negative images anyways versus full negative images. We just use those to help the shroud skeptic and to hurt my case in terms of the argument. So green check mark on both of these. However, and this finding was further scientifically substantiated by John DeSalvo's scientific findings as well. So it's scientifically confirmed. Everyone agrees with this. You can see the images on your screen. However, it must be said that there is a note of caution, because even though this method definitely has been proven beyond reproach to apply and fulfill this in terms of the cases of plants or leaves pressed in books, to date, it has never been incorporated in a way as to create even one single body part, let alone the entire frontal and dorsal side images of an entire human body. So yeah, there's just no experimental data for Volckringer patterns to do this. Though I will mention another shroud skeptic who we'll be learning about in a future show, Alan Mills. He claims to produce fingerprints using a combo of the singlet oxygen hypothesis, or the Russell effect, which we're going to be studying in part 16 in our next show, and Volckringer patterns combined below. But that's outside the purview of just the Volckringer pattern hypothesis simplistic alone. But just be aware of Alan Mills' claim there, and we'll get to that in our next show. Okay, so DeSalvo here, John DeSalvo, he postulates that a high resolution as opposed to a blurry image would be inevitable because under his revised theory, the cloth to body distance would be negligible. Basically, he posits, well, look, because of the sagging cloth, the shroud would have been under external pressure and or tightly wrapped around the body and sagging due to moisture, to be consistent with STURP scientist Dr. John German's version of the direct contact theory. So yeah, the cloth would be very close to the underlying body, and that would allow for high-resolution images to be formed. One thing I will say, in terms of John German's theory with the wet cloth, we actually found that it would require ideal conditions in order to create the high-resolution images, and on that front, we assigned a questionable status because of this. And since John DeSalvo is incorporating John German's wet sagging cloth hypothesis, it would also be questionable on that front. But again, I think that you can avoid that. Just, get rid of the sagging cloth, it's not wet or something, and then you get that green check mark, because we have seen that Volckringer patterns definitely do produce high resolution images. So let's assume the most charitable case. Even if John DeSalvo screwed up and brought in John German's theory about a sagging cloth, and that makes it a little questionable, he doesn't have to incorporate that aspect, and if we remove that, then the revised method doesn't suffer that questionable thing, therefore green check mark. All right, so let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 2, the body image uniformity. What do we find on this front? Okay, so starting off with the last aspect of this feature first, the substance uniformity. Remember, the shroud images encoded both hair and human skin and that sort of thing, and other substances if you believe that there are metal coins or flowers and stuff like that. But minimally, there's at least skin and hair encoded on the shroud, and everyone agrees with that. And this theory itself posits a real human body as opposed to a statue and that sort of thing. So therefore, because it's an ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, so therefore we have the question: would the Volckringer patterns definitely encode both the hair and the body images in a uniform fashion? Would the mechanism of Volckringer patterns operate uniformly on both hair and skin equally? Well, here's what John DeSalvo, the shroud skeptic, has to say in this case. Quote unquote, the answer as to why the man's hair leaves an impression on the cloth could be in the scalp. The apocrine sweat glands associated with hair produce a fatty sweat containing unsaturated fatty acids, urea, lactic acid. Oh, that's what's needed for Volckringer patterns, lactic acid, and other substances. The hair of the man on the shroud was probably drenched in sweat containing these acids. The evaporation of these acids, or their direct contact with the cloth, would also have produced cellulose degradation after many years. So this is what John DeSalvo says. Well, look, yeah, it would have been drenched in sweat. It would have been equally sweaty on his skin as well as his hair. And if you remember when we covered the direct contact and gas diffusion hypotheses in parts 13 and 14 of our solo series, the last shows we did, we said, well, this could be considered questionable, right? Because is it really the case? Would his hair really be as sweaty as his body, and encode equally and that sort of thing, especially when we get to the next two aspects, to encode with uniform intensity and uniform densities? I don't know about that, but nonetheless, for our purposes, let's give it to the guy. Sure, his hair could have been sweaty, and the sweat contains that lactic acid that we need to produce these patterns. Okay, very well. Now, in terms of the next aspect, the uniform density, it is very, very unlikely that either this method, the Volckringer Patterns, or the revised version of DeSalvo could account for the uniform maximum densities of both the frontal and the dorsal images, where they're as dark as each other in terms of their maximal darknesses or color densities. These methods would just suffer from the same gravitational issue that all other methods involving a body and direct contact of the cloth, right? The back image, because of gravity, would be expected to be darker and more entrenched and more degraded than the frontal image, where gravity is pressing the back of the man pressed into the cloth when he's lying down in a supine position. So that's just common sense, and this fails on that front, just like every other direct contact method does. Likewise, in terms of the body image in uniform intensity of color, remember, every individual fibril is colored individually to the exact same degree of darkness or color. It's just the exact same degree of yellow, or whatever the color is, as every other fibril. That it has that uniform intensity. And since all the fibrils have been colored individually in this way, that means that the lighter and darker areas of the body images on the shroud are caused by the density or the concentration of the individually encoded fibrils in any given location. So utter failure. This method, just impossible to create this. And guess what? Principle of enemy attestation, my friends. Even the shroud skeptic John DeSalvo, the guy who proposes this revised Volckringer Patterns, even he himself admits in his own article proposing this as a mechanism, he says, quote unquote, one additional problem with my theory that still needs to be resolved and hasn't yet is the uniformity of shading on the shroud fibers. So even DeSalvo himself is saying absolute failure, impossible, scientifically can't do it. I have no idea how to resolve this. And here he is admitting, not only the shroud skeptic admitting that there is this body image uniformity in terms of the intensity of the color on each individual fibril, but he's saying, look, the Volckringer Patterns, my revised method, totally hopeless. They can't explain this. Wow. Thank you. Principle of enemy attestation right there. Yeah, I appreciate DeSalvo's honesty. Obviously, that helps us out and that sort of thing. And you can read that for yourself. Again, I'm linking to DeSalvo's article. It's on page 8 of 9 on the PDF version of his paper there. So you can read what he says for yourself. All right, so let's move on to a controversial one, minimal relevant feature number 3. So this is the three-dimensional information encoded on the shroud. Okay, so this is the first part where I just have to be upfront and honest and admit I encountered a contradiction in terms of the various sources that I looked at and the claims between the pro-shroud experts versus the shroud skeptic, John DeSalvo and John Volckringer and that sort of thing. So on the one hand, look, shroud experts who are not partial to this theory, they claim that any such postulated three-dimensional information just doesn't encode. It's a total failure. In the first place, if you posit like stone slabs or something like that, that would just give a warped image that wouldn't give 3D info. The body would be crushed and flattened. Secondly, if you're giving the more charitable understanding, just saying, well, it's the lactic acid interacting with the linen cloth once it's transferred to the cloth, which is what the shroud skeptics actual hypothesis is, it lacks any three-dimensional effects at all, and produces nothing in the VP8 image analyzer. So this is by pro-shroud experts like Mark Antonacci, for example. John DeSalvo, on the other hand, he would claim the opposite and that sort of thing. Now, it's important to note, with Mark Antonacci, much of the conclusions drawn from this source, they seem to be interacting directly with Dr. Volckringer's method, his version from the 1940s, saying that what he's proposing, just Volckringer patterns in general, they don't produce any three-dimensional effects at all. But he's not specifically talking about, well, what about John DeSalvo's revised method? So what does DeSalvo say about his, in his article, DeSalvo mentions about, he actually provides quote-unquote VP8 images of various plants through his revised Volckringer patterns method. And he explains that in the case of the shroud's 3D nature, we should expect that, quote-unquote, the lactic acid concentration on the cloth would be less in areas where the cloth was farther from the body, and greater in areas where the cloth was closer to the body. The greater the lactic acid concentration, the more cellulose degradation would occur. Therefore, the intensity of the image produced would vary with the cloth-to-body distance. And so this is, according to John DeSalvo, again, he mentions this on page 5 and 7 of 9 in his article, which is freely available on my blog, so you can read his quote there. So he's claiming, look, no, it makes sense. It would produce these 3D images, and he provides actual alleged VP8 images of plants showing their three-dimensional nature. You're looking at it on your YouTube screens right now as we speak. On the other hand, there have been various shroud experts who've more recently commented to John DeSalvo's claims, contradicting him. So we have a quote from a shroud expert. So here's some of the experts claim, quote unquote, I suspect what appears to be 3D-ish elevation is a representation of relative chemical reaction, completely unassociated with spatial relationships. Here's another shroud expert, informative comment from January 2012 by Marty Benton. He says this, I wonder if what we think are 3D reliefs prepared from Volckringer patterns are not something altogether different. I suspect what appears to be these 3D-ish elevation is a representation of relative chemical reaction completely unassociated with spatial relationships. So that's the same quote. That was Marty Benton who says this, and they go on. The veins appear higher than the blade, and the higher still nearer to the center rib. That would seem to be where the most lactic acid would be transferred to the paper by contact and lakes of vapor. Yet the leaf seems really, really fat, with an unnaturally beveled edge. That apparent bevel may result from less lactic acid reaching the paper at the edge of the leaf. To fully assess this, we need to see the facing pages from the book that held the leaf. Ideally, we need to see the leaf. We need to know which side of the leaf is being plotted for 3D content. I imagine the facing pages imprint might have a similar appearance of elevated veins and a fat bevel. That would not make sense. The point is that because something appears to have 3D characteristics, it may not be real spatial representation as we have with the shroud. So I'm not saying that the shroud's image isn't spatial data, what you call height field. I'm saying, however, that we must consider other possibilities with respect to these Volckringer patterns and the VP8 image analyzer images we have. So this just points out the problems. This is why we need it needs to be peer reviewed. We can't trust these shroud skeptics and their claims. They give deceptive pictures that look like they're 3D images, but are they really? In the same way we've scientifically proven with the shroud. We've proven it is true spatial relationships encoded on the shroud's topographical information, and it's published in secular peer-reviewed science journals. These Volckringer pattern pictures that we get from John DeSalvo are not properly vetted. We lack all of these critical informations that Marty Benton complaining about. We need to be able to compare. We need to see the book. We need to see the leaf. We need to see which side of the leaf is being tested. And are there other possibilities to explain what looks to the naked eye like 3D images? And why are there some screw-ups here? It's not a true 3D image like the Shroud. It's got some massive mistakes in it. What caused that? Now, if that's not enough for you guys, let me invite on a Shroud skeptic, someone that you guys are well familiar with. I think he's the most knowledgeable, informative Shroud skeptic in the world that I've ever encountered, and my friend, he's been on the show, Hugh Ferry. What does Hugh Ferry say about John DeSalvo's claims about the three-dimensional VP8 image images of the Volckringer patterns? Here's what Hugh Ferry says. So this should convince all you fundy lay Shroud skeptics. Ferry's on my side here. So, quote unquote, Ferry says, "Do we in fact know anything about the Volckringer patterns except that they exist? Research into them seems vanishingly scarce, and there are only 3 purported examples on the internet, of which only one actually shows the plant and its effect. It's a fern, which makes me think the pattern could be a spore print. One of the others is too badly reproduced to be sure whether it's actually a print or the plant itself, and the other is the sort of image that might come from a VP8, but without any context or any explanation. John DeSalvo's paper on theshroud.com, which is the paper I'm linking to, called The Image Formation Process of the Shroud of Turin and its Similarities to Volckringer Patterns, references a paper by Jean Volckringer himself from 1942, but omits part of the title. He calls it Le Problème des Empreintes devant la Science. So that's French. If you're in France or Quebec, you'll know what he's saying. I don't know what it is. Quote unquote, but Ferry goes on. But in fact, it is called Le Saint Suaire de Turin, Le Problème. Okay, whatever. So he makes a mistake on the title. Ferry goes on, and is clearly more to do with the Shroud than it is to do with these patterns. Can anybody help? So here's Hugh Ferry saying, this Shroud expert, this Shroud skeptic, he's a champion for you fundy-laced skeptics that just want to dismiss the Shroud evidence. Even he is saying it's complete horsebunk. I can't find any empirical, scientific, credible data to back up that these Volckringer patterns actually produce 3D images. We just have John DeSalvo claiming that they do and providing pictures that could be deceptive and simply look like there's some kind of 3D data being printed on it. Do you just trust a single guy saying it? Absolutely not, skeptics. That's not the way to be interested in science. It's an interesting question. We require data and confirmation. There are key questions that need to be answered before we can say that this is actually encoding 3-dimensional information. On the other hand, we don't have that problem with the Shroud of Turin's images. Everyone admits, secular peer-reviewed journal, published in peer-reviewed journals, the 3-dimensional information is true 3-dimensional information, representative of spatial distances, body-to-cloth distances, and that topographic information. Nobody doubts that. Not John DeSalvo, not Hugh Ferry, not pro-Shroud experts. This, on the other hand, we have one guy, John DeSalvo, claiming, hey, look, they proved this. I'm not going to show you my results. I'm not going to show you my work, how I got it, or show you what the book looks like, what the leaf looks like, explain any of the needed context to understand if these truly are 3-dimensional images or not. Just believe me. I'm telling you they are. I'm telling you this is the VP8 image analyzer proving they do 3D images. Again, it may look convincing to your eyeballs if you just look at it. Yeah, when you look at the details, there's none of the critical information we need to make an assessment to see if it's true 3D info. And in fact, the 3D images that we get with this VP8 image analyzer from John DeSalvo proves the opposite. There's huge glaring mistakes. Look at some flat parts of the leaves. One of the leaves on the right-hand side there, it doesn't add up, and the experts are noticing these problems. So, so what do we do? What do I do on this front? Well, there's a genuine disagreement and contradiction. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to pretend to be one, but the experts themselves have a genuine clash. And I think on this front, given the lack of relevant data or lack of peer-reviewed publishing and the lack of critical information or details about the methodology and the results that were obtained, I assigned a questionable status in terms of the Volckringer Patterns' ability to create three-dimensional information. More information is needed before I would be confident in deciding one way or the other. So we'll leave that as a questionable status. Let's move on to minimal relevant feature number 4. Okay, so in terms of the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, we've already seen, look, it's scientifically impossible for any form of gas diffusion or direct contact mechanism to account for this. You're seeing up on your YouTube screens, look, direct contact results in a certain path where the thing is pressed down to the nose, for example. You're looking at the nose. In order to touch the cheek, you'd have to press the cloth in, and that produces a non-vertical distortion within the shroud. Or if it's a gas emission, poof, the gas evaporates in all directions equally. So you get path E, the emissions path. What do we find with the Shroud of Turin? It's path P, the vertical, straight line vertical or curvilinear projection path, either rectilinear or curvilinear. Impossible, scientifically impossible for a direct contact mechanism, like supposing that the cloth came into direct contact with the cheek and the nose, sides of the nose or whatever, through direct contact of the lactic acid, and sweat caused this thing. Impossible for the lactic acid to vaporize as a gas and puff up. That would be another projection path which isn't consistent with the Shroud of Turin. Impossible for these to account for it. Now you'll notice that John DeSalvo is quite clever because he knows about these scientifically minimal relevant features that have been scientifically proven in the peer-reviewed literature, and only a fool, like, for example, Allen, when I debated him, he just flat out denied these features. Then I sent him the link to the peer-reviewed journals. He no longer denied the features. But the point is these are undeniable. So it's an absolute failure. And this is why John DeSalvo himself kind of hinted in his theory, well, I'm positing a vertical gas diffusion field or something. A vertical gas diffusion field? What are you talking about? There is no such thing. Gases don't diffuse in a vertical straight lines. They diffuse in all directions. It's a law of nature. Impossible for them to diffuse in any other way other than in all directions equally. However, remember Barry Schwartz, unless there's an additional combination mechanism that's posited that could direct or focus the gas to diffuse in strictly vertical straight lines. What is that? John DeSalvo doesn't tell us, doesn't provide any information. As we'll see when we get to the electrostatic hypotheses or mechanisms, there may be an option here. An electrostatic field or mechanism might be able to guide the gas so that it only goes in a straight line vertical direction or in a curvilinear direction in codation path on the shroud. But that's not part of this theory proper, so utter failure, right? So if you posit that, we'll put a question point for the time being until we get to it. But without any kind of vertical aligning or vertically focusing outside mechanism that's working in conjunction to focus the gas, impossible. It'll just go all directions. You won't encode the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Well, what about the non-contact zones then? This is another aspect of feature 4. So obviously gas diffusion, gas diffusion of the lactic acid. This can travel through the air, even if it's not touching the cloth. If it's close enough, it will go up and get onto the cloth that way through empty space. Now, one thing here, DeSalvo also postulates John German's sagging wet cloth hypothesis, or just the sagging cloth theory, right? So DeSalvo says, quote unquote, it is possible that the linen was originally stiff, similar to a starched shirt, and that it gradually sagged closer to the body as it became softer in the tomb. This has been proposed by John German, a member of STIRP, and would account for how the cloth got close enough to produce the high-resolution images by the vertical diffusion of lactic acid. Again, though, remember, diffusion would allow for the encoding of images through empty space as the gases would float up, but gases don't just go in a vertical direction. So that's a problem here. Also, if you use the sagging cloth explanation, and that's kind of needed for the vertical aspect, I'm guessing here, it's very unlikely that a cloth would sag, either wet or otherwise, would sag perfectly so as to allow for only vertically mapped wrapping distortions to emerge or to encode on the shroud. I find that it's highly improbable. Again, it all comes down to the fact gases are, by definition, they're randomly oriented processes. Diffusive spreading is expected to encode not just vertically, but in all various directions. And that's even within the short 4 centimeter range. Because remember, one of our minimal relevant features, the Shroud of Turin, the images are only encoded 4 centimeters or closer. So the cloth had to be 4 centimeters or closer to the body. If it was 4.1 centimeters away from the body, nothing encoded, none of the image. Are gases limited by 4 centimeters in range? No, not really, not necessarily. It can encode past that or shorter than that. What is it about 4 centimeters that's the cutoff? Well, there's nothing about lactic acid and gas form say that 4 centimeters is the cutoff. Why isn't it less than 4 centimeters or maybe more than 4 centimeters? Just a little hint. Well, what would radiation could terminate at 4 centimeters or less? Interesting. We'll have to remember that when we get to future mechanisms and that sort of thing. That said, in terms of the non-contact zones, I do think that the gas diffusion theory, outside of this sagging cloth bit, obviously lactic acid would diffuse and it can encode the non-contact areas. Would it encode all of the non-contact areas so that we have full body images? That's questionable. I'm not sure about that. Finally, the final aspect of minimal relevant feature number 4, there's no body sides or tops of the man's head that are encoded as images on the Shroud of Turin. That's a failure on this front. In the same way it's the exact same as our analysis of gas diffusion models and or direct contact hypotheses in parts 14 and 13. When we looked at the no body sides images, we found that it would be improbable, at very least very questionable, as to whether any explanation would account for this. Gases would diffuse, he would be sweaty from his body sides, as well as the top of his head and that sort of thing, and if the shroud was wrapped around him, his body sides would be encoded. Why aren't they? Again, well, remember Barry Schwartz and Ray Rogers, they tried to posit, well, maybe there was spice racks and that lifted the sides of the shroud away from the body sides. Still, would it be perfectly pristine so that no part of the body sides would be formed? Well, how high are these spice packs, these spice bundles? Is it the exact same height as the body so that it's totally level? Were they aligned in such a way that not even one part of the body sides would have been touching the cloth or near enough the cloth that the gas would diffuse and create a part of a body side image? Or what if the bundles were higher than the body? That would lift the cloth up and maybe part of the frontal image wouldn't be encoded on the shroud. But the Shroud of Turin is perfect. What if the spice bundles were slightly lower than the body? Well, that would press the cloth down and maybe might be touching some of the body sides. Yet, nope, the Shroud of Turin is perfect. Full-on vertical alignment, vertically encoded mapping process, only the front and dorsal side, none of the body side images are encoded perfectly. So I'm going to say it's a failure here, and whatever I assigned in the gas diffusion and direct contact theories, it's the exact same assessment in terms of this theory here. Okay, so let's move on to the 5th minimal relevant feature. So this is the body image superficiality, non-saturation, and non-capillary flow or cementation of the fibers. Now, one of the main issues with the Volckringer method is that the example of a plant being imprinted on multiple adjacent pages in a book means that, well, quite obviously by definition, look, the science proves that this effect goes beyond the superficial layers of the pages, right? It encodes images throughout various layers, various pages throughout the book. The cellulose pages are degraded at multiple levels. So by definition, this is a failure, almost. The science used to say that this method does it proves that it can't be this method, right? Just at face value, if you're going to use these plants in books as your proof that, well, look, we can produce these images. Yeah, but they're not superficial. They're on multiple pages throughout. So yeah, this mechanism obviously causes the images to be deeply embedded into the various layers of the book due to the tremendous amount of pressure being applied. What's more here, this theory involves a decomposing corpse and large amounts of sweat or lactic acid being placed under varying degrees of pressure, either from some form of external pressure or by a sagging cloth. So we would expect to see capillary action or flow and some kind of cementation evident on the image-bearing fibrils on the Shroud of Turin. And that would, in turn, cause image saturation on the shroud, just like we saw with any other form of decomposition or gas diffusion when it involves sweat. Again, especially around the bodily orifices, there would be image saturation. The images would be so dark. They would be utterly saturated, as dark as they could possibly be. And there would definitely be capillary flow and cementation in those areas. So yeah, it's an utter failure here. And believe it or not, look, principle of enemy attestation. John DeSalvo himself, in his own article, raises this important issue, and he tries to provide a possible solution to it. So here's what DeSalvo says, quote unquote, one possible explanation would be that the lactic acid was confined to the surface by the low factor of absorbency of the cloth. This may explain why lactic acid was confined to the surface. So he's trying to explain the superficiality of the shroud. Then, over a period of time, the lactic acid caused cellulose degradation. The lactic acid was eventually removed either by washing or by evaporation. So by the time of the 1532 fire, no organic molecules were present on the shroud. What did remain was only the image produced by cellulose degradation. So that's what John DeSalvo has to say about this. Personally, I find this very dubious, to say the least. In the first place, think about all the molecules could have entirely evaporated or oxidized from this thing. Well, that's very ad hoc, so that we don't detect it today, and it wasn't affected at the time of the 1532 fire. No organic molecules present on the shroud. Don't believe you. Remember, the bloodstains have survived intact here and stuff like that. So it's very ad hoc to posit that they've completely oxidized, even down to the level of molecules. That said, again, the evaporation of molecules themselves isn't a proper consideration under this feature, at least. That it's more under the additional features category below, and we'll talk about that more. But yeah, in relation to this present feature, body image superficiality on the 3 levels, it is possible to say that something like Ray Rogers' surface starch layer, remember they found that counter feature, that was starch impurities on the surface of the shroud, some of the shroud. Again, it wasn't everywhere and that sort of thing, so we kind of refuted this. But there are these starch impurities. That's a minimal relevant feature and a counter feature. So maybe someone might posit, well, Ray Rogers found starch impurities on the surface layer, so maybe his hypothesis that there was a starch layer only on the superficial levels of the shroud, maybe that's true. And then somehow this micro-thin layer was what chemically reacted with the lactic acid to produce the surface images. Something like that would work. Obviously, it would depend on, well, is lactic acid in gas form, is that lighter than air gas, or is it heavier than air gas, or not? Now, another consideration here is the low absorbency of the shroud's linen. That's already been taken into account as various scientific experiments have been conducted testing various versions of the direct contact and gas diffusion hypotheses over the years, as we covered in parts 13 and 14 of this series. None of them, even though they included sweat, which has this lactic acid in it, and therefore we would expect Volckringer patterns to succeed, all of them have failed to produce images that fill the body image superficiality feature on the shroud. Yeah, I think that's it in terms of body image superficiality. Okay, so moving on to minimal relevant feature number 6. Well, believe it or not, so under ideal conditions, we're just going to give the Shroud skeptics to be generous. Yeah, it can account for the anatomical accuracies. It uses a real body. Okay, great. No decomposition. Okay, maybe like Ray Rogers or them, the body was removed very quickly before rigor mortis ended or before liquid decomposition accumulated in sufficient amounts. Again, remember there were some issues when we looked at gas diffusion. Well, if the lactic acid in your sweat, you're decomposing enough so that these lactic acids is diffusing as a gas and that sort of thing. Well, would that require there to be enough time that there would be at least some sufficient levels of decomposition liquids, especially in areas around the body orifices? That's questionable, or probably or most likely it's an improbable aspect and therefore fails. But we're just going to give the same assessment to that we gave in the gas diffusion things to save time here. Likewise, with in terms of the blood stain images, which is the final aspect of feature number 6 here, we already described that. It fails. It has to rely on direct contact. And as we saw in part 13, the bloodstains cannot be encoded through direct contact or a combination of direct contact and painting or with painting alone. But this method would posit simple direct contact as an ordinary naturalistic mechanism. So utter failure on the blood and assumed 2 green check marks for the other 2 anatomical accuracies and the no decomposition liquids, though with the latter, bear in mind there are those issues that we discussed in terms of the gas diffusion models in part 14, and that would apply to the Volckringer pattern thesis as well. Okay, finally, minimal relevant feature number 7. So these are the additional features. So what are some of the additional features that are relevant to Volckringer patterns as a mechanism here? Okay, so the first additional minimal relevant feature is additional feature number 3. This is about the color. The basically photomicrographs and samples of the Shroud of Turin show that the body image's color is a result of concentrations of yellow to light brown or sepia colored fibers. So that's the color that we're talking about here. And as I mentioned when we first started, this is where there's another contradiction. Just like with the three-dimensional nature of the Shroud images, there's a contradiction here between what John DeSalvo, the Shroud skeptic, says versus what the pro-Shroud scientists say. So in the first place, we have to say, look, the images of the plants given by Jean Volckringer back in the 1940s and 1991, as discovered by Dr. Jean Volckringer, are brown in color, even after a period of decades or centuries. And they're not straw yellow. They're just not consistent with the Shroud of Turin. Absolute failure. Nobody can deny it. Again, a good source here is Mark Antonacci's book. He writes about this in his Resurrection of the Shroud book. So utter failure on this front. However, the revised Volckringer method, John DeSalvo, he claims that he's been able to reproduce the Shroud's color in terms of this straw yellow type color or light brown coloring. And he claims in his paper to quote unquote to have conducted a quantitative color comparison between the Shroud and his Volckringer pattern images using a spectrophotometer. And using this, he compared their visible spectral reflectance data, and apparently they produced similar results, according to him. So here's what he says in his own words. Quote unquote, I have done a quantitative color comparison between the Volckringer patterns and the Shroud's body image. Using a spectrophotometer, I obtained visible spectral reflectance data from Volckringer patterns and compared them to the reflectance data of the Shroud's body image obtained by Ray Rogers and Marion Gilbert in 1978. The comparison shows that specific Shroud body areas are almost identical, but not identical, almost identical, to a typical Volckringer pattern. Another of my studies shows that specific Shroud body areas are almost identical to a typical Volckringer pattern. And here on your YouTubes, he quotes figure 3 in his paper, so You can see that up on your YouTube screens if I was able to find that. Going on, DeSalvo says, another of my studies showed that the Volckringer patterns do not fluoresce under ultraviolet light. So remember, that's another additional feature of the shroud. We're not talking about, that's not controversial. I kind of agree with that. This is consistent with the shroud body image, which also does not fluoresce under ultraviolet light. It should be noted that both the linen shroud and the paper on which the Volckringer patterns are produced have a high cellulose content. So that's what John DeSalvo claims here. However, this is highly controversial. Virtually every other scientist in the world disagrees with this, with John DeSalvo. And they say, no, it produces brown images. And you can see on your YouTube screen, I've got some images provided by not a pro-shroud expert, none other than the expert shroud skeptic, our good friend Hugh Ferry himself. What does Hugh Ferry have to say about this? And here's what he says, responding to this. Strange. Again, the DeSalvo paper shows a picture of the Volckringer pattern on the page that covered the plant leaf and possibly another on the page that was under the plant, and claims that the spectroscopic characteristics of both Volckringer and shroud images are quote-unquote almost identical. Mark Antonacci, on the other hand, says that the Volckringer image of a plant is quote-unquote imprinted usually several pages from where the plant lay, and says that the plant image was brown, dark brown, and not the straw yellow color of the shroud image. And then Hugh Ferry says, well, which of these sets of observations is true? I wonder. Has anybody got a copy of Volckringer's paper? As far as I can see, all comments about Volckringer come via Pierre Barbet, and I would so much like to see the primary source. Meanwhile, Hugh Ferry says he's found this on the web, and he quotes gives a couple pictures from the Smithsonian Gardens files, where using Volckringer patterns, you can see these are clearly dark brown. They're nothing like the Shroud of Turin, contradicting John DeSalvo and his claims here. So look on your YouTube screens, you've got a couple of images on that front. So what the heck do we make of all of this? Once again, it looks like there's contradictions. Look, Hugh Ferry is trying to say, well, look, we've got this claim from John DeSalvo that they have similar spectrographic features and that sort of thing. But yet all the other experiments show colors, including Jean Volckringer himself, which are just nothing like the straw yellow color of the Shroud of Turin. This is why we need more details. This is why we need peer review before we're going to believe a shroud skeptic on this front. So I would just say, look, it's questionable. We need further details before we can rule. Is John DeSalvo lying? Is he made a mistake? Is he screwed up something? Is there a trick involved? Some reason as to why he's claiming this? I don't think we can just dismiss what he says without good reason. But on the other hand, we have very credible scientists. Pretty much everyone who doesn't believe in the Volckringer patterns hypothesis says it produces brown coloring, and we have visual images showing that and that. So it's highly controversial. And again, I put a questionable status here because we've got this fundamental contradiction in what the sources are saying. You know, the guys, John DeSalvo, who's a lone proponent for the Volckringer method today, he says it produces colors. He claims that he has this spectrographic evidence as proof in his paper. On the other hand, all the other experts seem to be saying, well, it looks like everything we know about it, it doesn't produce a straw yellow color like the Shroud of Turin, produces dark brown or brown images. So yeah, questionable status on that. Okay, the final additional feature that's relevant to this method is additional feature number 6. And that's where we have the microchemical evaluation has indicated no evidence of any spices, oils, nor any other biochemical or organic substances produced by a human body in life or in death. So remember, this, like with direct contact or gas diffusion models, this also relies on sweat, the body being covered in copious amounts of sweat in order to get that enough lactic acid to transfer to the cloth in one way or another, and thereby degrade the cellulose in terms of producing Volckringer patterns. So it has to be said, look, Volckringer patterns have many similar spectral properties in common with the shroud images. That's true. However, it requires that lactic acid is crucial to the image formation, and that must have been present on the shroud in order to produce the images. Unfortunately, all such substances are not detected on the Shroud of Turin today. So yeah, to fix this problem, it has to be supposed, oh, well, that's because all the substances completely oxidized away entirely before the 1532 fire and the subsequent water dousing of the shroud, because obviously that would be an issue if it was still there at that time. So how does DeSalvo put it? John DeSalvo, he says, quote unquote, the lactic acid was eventually removed either by washing or by evaporation, so that by the time of the 1532 fire, no organic molecules were present on the shroud. What did remain was only the image produced by cellulose degradation. Now, I think that this is a highly ad hoc presumption, especially if you think that the shroud was created as Volckringer patterns in the medieval period. Within a couple centuries, it was all gone. That's really ridiculous. But nonetheless, I assigned a questionable status just based on the ad hocness here. So that's my assessment of all the minimal relevant features. Let's get into the cumulative case considerations and my overall conclusion for the Volckringer patterns hypothesis here. Okay, so let's start with our first best explanation inference criteria, plausibility. Is this Volckringer patterns and the revised Volckringer patterns of DeSalvo a plausible mechanism? No, it's wholly implausible, utter failure on this front. It's not consistent with our background knowledge compared to other hypotheses. So in the first place, look, it has to be admitted that the Volckringer patterns have been able to reproduce some of the remarkable minimal relevant features on the Shroud of Turin, or there's a plausible case that it could. In certain cases where it's questionable, maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. There's a lot of questionable elements here. So it is plausible on that front that it explains a lot of features, or at least could explain a lot of features and that sort of thing. And John DeSalvo's article proves that. But nonetheless, it remains a fact that, look, there's no single known image of a human body or even part of a human body that's been formed using Volckringer patterns. All of this scientific experimental data is about plants being crushed in books and pressed in the pages of books over decades or centuries of time, and then producing these images. That's all we've got. There's been no experimental data that proves that a human body or even part of a human body can be reproduced using Volckringer patterns in this way, or the way supposed under this method, through lactic acid, being transferred to the cloth either as a gas vapor or through direct contact with the cloth. There's no proof that this would work in the same way as Volckringer patterns are formed with plants being put in books, and then the lactic acid transfers to the pages of the book. It seems very highly questionable in terms of its plausibility as to whether the experimental data that we do have is that applicable to the human body being covered in a shroud and then lactic acid transferring to the cloth that way, especially let alone a full-sized adult human being, both frontal and dorsal side images. That just seems implausible. Given the background knowledge of what we have in terms of the experimental data to date. All right, next, in terms of the plausibility criterion, don't forget, as we kind of covered in terms of the practical implausibility of both direct contact mechanisms in part 13 of this solo series and gas diffusion mechanisms in part 14 of this solo series, all of those implausibility problems apply to this method, the Volckringer patterns method. There's nothing different. The only thing that's different is, well, the chemical agent involved is lactic acid producing Volckringer patterns that's creating the images. But in terms of all the practical implausibilities discussed in the direct contact and gas diffusion models, those all apply to this method equally. And don't forget, we've done various scientific experiments, field experiments with sweaty bodies or sweaty statues containing sweat-like material that would have lactic acid in it. And these have all failed in the field. We have the field and lab experiments testing both direct contact and gas diffusion models, and they all fail to produce Shroud of Turin images. Well, those apply to this, right? Because if you're testing out a sweaty body or to see if sweat would on a statue or something would chemically create shroud images and that sort of thing, and they fail, that applies to this, right? You have a sweaty body, and it's just that active key agent, chemical agent involved is the lactic acid in this case with Volckringer patterns. That's the only difference. So in that case, all those experiments would make it practically implausible that this method would work any better than any other mechanism that just posits a sweaty body. All those problems apply. So it's practically implausible there. And then finally, it's also theoretically implausible that this Volckringer mechanism would work because it's highly dubious as to whether a human body, whether either living or dead, could even produce a sufficient amount of sweat. Remember, there's only a small amount of lactic acid. If lactic acid is the key chemical agent here, there's only a small amount of that in our sweat relative to other chemicals, like in the Maillard reaction or ammonia gas or the urea and stuff like that. There's more concentrations of that in sweat than there is of this lactic acid. So theoretically, there's an implausibility here. Given our background knowledge, there's this issue. Is it even possible or plausible for a human being to produce enough amount of sweat containing the lactic acid that's necessary to produce the images? And yeah, there is this theoretical implausibility that applies specifically to Volckringer patterns because lactic acid's what's important and there's only a small amount of that in the sweat. Is it really plausible for one human body, whether living or dead, doesn't matter, to produce enough sweat in order to get enough of that fraction of the lactic acid needed to create the body images, chemically react with the cloth and transfer up to produce those images? No, that seems implausible to me. I think it's obvious the Volckringer method fails the plausibility criterion. They're both practically and theoretically implausible to be the explanation for the Shroud of Turin's images. All right, what about in terms of our next explanatory criterion, the explanatory scope? What's the quantity of the minimal relevant features that this hypothesis covers? Well, in the first place, look, we said that this method doesn't even attempt to deal with the bloodstains, and it just instead relies on the direct contact mechanism, which we showed failed. Direct contact mechanisms can't explain the bloodstains, so this is an utter failure of explanatory scope on its part. What's more, even the proponent, John DeSalvo himself, admits that this method just can't resolve or account at all for the body image uniform intensity of color. He says that's just a total failing of my method. It can't do it. I don't know how to do it or how to resolve this issue. So again, utter failure on the explanatory scope just on those two mechanisms alone. All right, what about explanatory power, the quality of the hypothesis? How well does it explain the facts without any vagueness, effort, or ambiguity? Well, we've seen that it fails on several features. Look, it's an absolute failure on the body image uniform intensity. We saw that it was an absolute failure in terms of body image maximal uniform densities. It can't explain why the frontal and dorsal images are as dark as each other. We would expect just due to the effects of gravity, the dorsal image would be darker. It's got several aspects that are questionable in terms of three-dimensional data, high-resolution issues, superficiality, and some of the additional features are questionable, so that adds some vagueness or ambiguity in terms of it. In terms of least amount of effort, look, the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, minimal relevant feature number 4, utter failure on this front. And John DeSalvo has to help himself. Well, I'm just going to assert that somehow the gases weren't diffusing in all directions. They were only vertically aligned somehow, some way. Well, that's an utter failure on explanatory power. You're really having to appeal to some combination type an external mechanism, maybe like Barry Schwartz does, an electrostatic field somehow focus the gas to only travel vertically in rectilinear or curvilinear lines or something like that. But again, that's not part of the Volckringer method proper. John DeSalvo just asserts that somehow the gases were vertically aligned. So yeah, that requires effort, I think, especially when you don't know what that mechanism is. John DeSalvo doesn't appeal to electrostatic mechanisms or any other external mechanisms and that sort of thing. So for that reason, I think that requires some effort to just assume it's vertically aligned. But otherwise, apart from some kind of external mechanism, it's an utter failure. It can't explain. The Volckringer Patterns hypothesis doesn't have the power to explain that feature of the shroud. And then finally, in terms of the color, it's ambiguous as to whether or not this mechanism is able to account for that or whatever. There's contradictory claims, and it's therefore a questionable status, and that leaves an element of ambiguity. So utter failure in terms of explanatory power, explanatory scope, and plausibility. Therefore, this theory is improbable. But as we saw, there's a lot of questionable elements like body image superficiality. Is lactic acid in gas, is that a lighter than air gas, a heavier than air gas? And what does that mean in terms of image superficiality and image saturation and that sort of thing? So in terms of the less ad hoc criterion, where the hypothesis that employs the least amount of ad hoc components, which means non-evidenced assumptions, is obviously, or questionable elements is obviously the best hypothesis. So the theory as proposed by John DeSalvo postulates that all the lactic acid molecules must have evaporated before the 1532 fire. He also postulates that the body was removed before any signs of decomposition and sufficient quantities could have been deposited onto the linen in detectable quantities. So he's kind of like Ray Rogers with his Maillard reaction in that regards. He also assumes, look, there's the existence of these ideal conditions which are necessary just for the precise proper amount of external pressure to be placed on the shroud, either by wrapping it or something like that, to ensure that it was close enough to the body to let the lactic acid transfer to the cloth, in either through direct contact or in a gas form. And also he incorporates John German's theory about the wet sagging cloth, whereby the cloth just sags and conforms perfectly to every part of the underlying body to encode the continuous images, not encode the body side images, while still ensuring that it's vertically aligned. All of the images are encoded through vertically aligned mapping process. That's highly ad hoc. So yeah, I would say that this theory fails the less ad hoc criterion on that front. It employs multiple non-evidenced assumptions, so it's an utter failure there as well. So yeah, that's it. Obviously, as you can tell, this theory is a failure. I don't think it works. The Volckringer patterns, even by the admission of the shroud skeptics themselves, John DeSalvo himself admitted, at least with regards to certain minimal relevant features like the body image uniform intensity of color, utter failure. Just can't do it, inherently can't do it, and he has no clue how to resolve that issue. Well, you need to know how to resolve that. If you want to explain the shroud's images, you have to explain all of their minimal relevant features. You can't just dismiss the minimal relevant features that you don't like because your method doesn't explain it. So yeah, Volckringer method, not the explanation of the shroud. It's very, very improbable. In fact, scientifically impossible. It's been falsified by the admission of the proponents of this method themselves with respect to certain features like that uniform intensity of color. Utter failure. All right, so that's it in terms of the Volckringer patterns. Next time with the Shroud solo series, we'll be turning to our next ordinary naturalistic hypothesis, and that's the singlet oxygen theory, or otherwise known as the Russell effect. So this was invented by my good friend, that heretic and shroud skeptic, David Russell from Proselytize or Apostatize. Sorry, that was a horrible joke. No, David Russell is a good guy. He's not the guy that invented the Russell effect or uses the Russell effect to explain the Shroud of Turin's images. Obviously, he's my Christian co-host from the Theo Geeks podcast there, so I was just joking at his expense. Bad jokes aside, that's what we'll be looking at next time. So the Russell effect, or the singlet oxygen hypothesis mechanism, as advanced by people like Robert Lomas, Christopher Knight, and Dr. Alan Mills. So look out for that next time. All right, take care. Bye-bye.